Hello, my name is Andrea Camp, and on behalf of the Civil Society Institute, I want to thank you for joining us today to learn about the Institute's most recent findings of a 4-year study looking at public support for renewable energy and how the concern about water safety, quality, and availability plays a role in how voters approach environmental policies. The Civil Society Institute has been doing public opinion research in energy policy and the environment since 2004. CSI's approach to understanding public opinion is unique. We look for common ground. We want to understand the ways differences can be bridged so that collectively we can create breakthroughs on solutions. Currently, much of public opinion research measures the depth of division and conflict and leads to identifying political wedge issues instead of seeking solutions. CSI's approach, however, seeks to advance solutions by demonstrating where political openings exist. We believe progress is often hidden when gridlocked political parties and elected officials fail to see or refuse to see how to move beyond hyperpartisanship. In seeking common ground and taking a solutions-oriented approach to research, we intentionally avoid the usual binary approach of for or against. Instead, we believe research that looks for common ground and for what works more powerfully reveals the way forward. As you will hear today from our bipartisan team of researchers, Democratic pollster Molly O'Rourke from Hart Research and Republican pollster Vince Brailio from Brailio and Associates, our research finds consistent, strong public support for renewable energy. While support is wide and deep, it does not necessarily come from the same motivation. Some see it as expanding new technology, some as practical ways to save money and gain independence from utility companies. Still others see it as a move consistent with their values as environmentalists or as the answer to climate change. The fact that there are a variety of reasons behind the support and acceptance of renewable energy is good news. We must be mindful of all these motivations so that we do not dampen the growing support and acceptance of renewable energy among Americans. Our research underscores how one speaks about renewable energy matters. With that, I now turn the presentation over to Vince Brailio from Brailio and Associates.
Hi all, I'm delighted to be able to take you through the first part of a presentation which it will focus on renewable energy in the United States from our perspective, having done research on this question over the last 4 years. First, just a word with regard to the methodology used in this survey that we're reporting on today. We're going to be reporting primarily on data gathered in 2017 in October at the end of the year, following the first full year of the Trump presidency. The total sample that we interviewed in this particular survey was 1,781 eligible voters. Of that number, 1,200 of them were actually registered voters. As we go through the presentation today, we will be focusing on that sample of registered voters, in other words, the 1,200 who told us they were registered to vote. We have followed the issue of renewable energy closely through survey research over the last 4 years, beginning with a post-election study following the 2014 by-election. We have been very interested in the overall consensus of enthusiasm for the rapid adoption of renewable energy that has existed in each of our studies over that time. And we were very concerned and interested about the questions that are on the screen in front of you. Has the enthusiasm regarding solutions on renewable energy increased or decreased after this first year of the Trump presidency? And in the second question, are voters still ready to work across partisan and ideological lines on the issue of renewable energy? I'm going to preview just briefly the answers to those two questions. The answer to the first question is regarding the enthusiasm for more rapid adoption of renewable energy. Has it increased or decreased? It has actually increased a bit after the first year of Donald Trump. Are voters still ready to work across partisan lines? There's a very interesting divide that you will see along partisan lines over the question of how we proceed with renewable energy. This just reviews our methodology from the 2017 study, and we've already reflected that, so let's move on to the next slide. The top takeaways from our 2017 survey include the following. Renewable energy and clean water are issues of particular importance to the electorate and offer opportunities for a sizable breakthrough in bipartisan cooperation. The key is whether we can move aggressively forward with renewable energy and clean water as supported by both sides of the political aisle. It's this issue of bringing people together in a concerted effort to move these issues forward on the agenda politically. We have an opportunity with a group of voters that we identify in this study called solutions voters to mobilize their support for renewable energy. And these are voters who are willing to set aside partisan and ideological differences and focus particularly on solutions. And we find in this research are the principal drivers for both renewable energy and clean water policies. Renewable energy support divides over the question of fossil fuels. You have in front of you two graphs. The pie on the left shows in the blue the percent of people in this country who are pro-renewable energy, 63% in the 2017 survey, which we're now reporting on. 37% were pessimistic fence sitters. That is, they didn't take a strongly pro-renewable or anti-renewable position, but were very pessimistic about the ability to come together on any kind of a solution with regard to renewables. As we examined the slice of the pie on the right of that left-hand graph, we discovered that it actually divides into two almost equal sections. One is pro-renewable and also pro-fossil fuels. The other is pro-renewable but anti-fossil fuels. This differentiation between these two audiences was identified in a statistical technique called segmentation analysis. To arrive at this finding, we took 4 policy positions with regard to renewable energy, which are recorded and reviewed in this slide. Let me briefly identify the items that we used. The first item was accelerating development of renewable energy will result in cleaner air and water for everyone. Accelerating the development of renewable energy could create tens of thousands of new jobs. Fossil fuels must remain the cornerstone of our energy system because of cost and jobs. Transitioning away from fossil fuels such as oil, natural gas, etc. will make our products more expensive and less competitive. Now, when you look at the results, you can see the effect of the differentiation between the two segments, the pro-renewable anti-fossil and the pro-renewable pro-fossil. You'll note that on the first two items, there's virtually no difference between the attitudes of the pro-renewable who are anti-fossil and the pro-renewable who are pro-fossil. But when you get to the last two items, the issue of fossil fuels and how it impacts on the discussion of renewable energy, you can see a huge difference between these two audiences. 64%, for example, of the pro-renewable, pro-fossil group believe that fossil fuels must remain the cornerstone of our energy system because of cost and jobs. 2% among the pro-renewable, anti-fossil hold a similar view. Let's look at the pro-renewable, pro-fossil fuels audience. This audience is more politically balanced than the pro-renewable anti-fossil, with 48% Democratic identifiers, 34% Republican. It is also more diverse, 36% African American and Hispanic. It's younger, 57% are under 50. More religiously active, more likely to be employed, and less well educated than the pro-renewable, anti-fossil fuels group. So let's look at that group next. This is clearly a Democratic audience, 61% versus 17% for Republicans. It is less diverse, 16% African American and Hispanic. It is older, 58% over 50. They are also less religiously active, less likely to be employed, primarily because they're an older audience, more well educated by far, with 48% being college grads or higher. The third audience that we have identified is the next one, the pessimistic group. Let's see it now in the next slide. The audience of fence sitters is clearly more Republican, which is not unexpected. And it includes those who have no strong position on renewable energy or who are generally negative towards it. And the principal demographic characteristic, as I mentioned, is the fact that they are dominated by Republicans, 52% over Democrats, 2-1. On this graphic, you have our data over time with regard to renewable energy and the policy questions which we just reviewed. You can see in the top bar the total support for renewable energy over time. Starting in 2014 with 57%, followed in 15 with 55%, same 55% in 2016, and then an uptick in 2017 to 63%. That is a significant uptick in support for renewable energy in the total aggregate. Now, when you break that into the two audiences that we just described, what you find is that the pro-renewable, anti-fossil fuel audience has decreased over time by about 3 points. The pro-renewable, pro-fossil audience, starting at 24% in 2014, has increased in 2017 up to 33%. The audience growth in the pro-renewable, pro-fossil fuel segment comes primarily from folks who were more pessimistic in previous years, but whose sense of optimism has increased, and belief that in the Trump era, you can actually address renewables without destroying the fossil fuel industry. Looking at the issues of issue of renewable energy in terms of its overall priority, we find that when asked to judge the priority among 10 separate issues, reducing the use of fossil fuels, oil and gas, for electric power and transportation is a very high level of issue importance for both pro-fossil and anti-fossil pro-renewable audiences at 60% plus. However, when you ask about the optimism that people have for addressing this issue, the picture changes dramatically. In this slide, you can see how that question regarding optimism that we can work together and solve the issue of renewables changes with regard to the question of the use of fossil fuels. Those pro-renewable, pro-fossil believe that in the era of Trump that it is possible to work together and solve and move forward with the question of renewable energy, particularly with regard to the use of fossil fuels. But the pro-renewable, anti-fossil audience seems to reject that position quite strongly. The fence sitters are also very pessimistic, 61%, regarding our ability as a country to move forward with renewable energy solutions. Hence the label that we've given them as pessimistic fence sitters. There is a similar consensus on clean water to the consensus on renewable energy. Clean water advocates actually total slightly more than the pro-renewable audience at 67% versus 63%. But as we look deeper into the clean water audience, we can see that it too divides. Let's look at the next slide. The water advocates, 67%, actually divide into two separate, almost equally sized audiences. One audience is our water advocates question the use of technology in addressing the challenge of keeping our water clean and safe. The other audience is very pro-technology in terms of using it to keep our water clean and safe. Here are the policy statements that reflect these differences. The first three items have to do with keeping our water safe for things like swimming and recreation and managing our scarce water resources in a more effective way and taking pesticides and chemicals from our water. On those questions, both water advocate audiences, those who are pro-technology and those who are questioning technology, are in terrific agreement. But when you begin to introduce the issue of technology into the question of keeping our water safe and potable for consumers, you can see the great difference that emerges between these two audiences. With the pro-technology group, a strong majority believing that technology is a principal player in keeping water safe for consumers. And the water advocate audience who have some questions about technology are significantly less optimistic and less likely to agree with each of those questions. The one question which touches on global warming at the very bottom of the list shows the greatest differences between these two audiences, with one questioning the ocean level rise as warming from the warming of our oceans in terms of perhaps being exaggerated, and the other audience of water advocates who question technology rejecting that position very strongly. Before we go to the next slide, let me introduce my colleague, Molly O'Rourke, who has been part of this research from the very beginning, and she is going to take us through the remaining part of this presentation.
Thank you so much, Vince. And I would like to pick up by talking about a very important and distinct group of voters who civil society has identified and been committed to tracking over the past 3 years. We've labeled them or identified them as solutions voters, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about who they are and what they represent. First, just to let you know how we went about identifying solutions voters. Vince mentioned earlier that we engaged in segmentation analysis, and that is the process that we used to identify these solutions voters. It's a multivariate technique that allows us to look at and identify voters who are similar on a variety of measures. So they share some demographic characteristics, but more importantly, they share similar attitudes and approaches about public policy and the kinds of solutions who they want to see. And as I said, we have been tracking them for civil society since 2014. And a couple of distinguishing characteristics about these solutions voters. First is that they prefer bipartisan solutions to solve problems and really are engaged in consensus building. The second point is that they're especially news attentive and engaged in policy issues. That doesn't mean that they are perfectly informed. They have misperceptions as well, but they are generally a segment of the electorate that's very engaged. They also have a broad range of issues that they consider priorities. So these are not single issue voters. These are voters who consider a wide variety of challenges to be important to them personally. And what makes them unique is that these voters, this group of solutions voters, believe that solutions exist to these problems and that we can make progress. They see hurdles and obstacles to that progress, and we'll talk about that, but they remain optimistic that solutions exist and that they are realizable solutions. And I'll say a little bit more about these solutions voters. They are made up of voters from both parties. So they are both Democrats and Republicans, although generally they are not strong partisans. And the plurality of them are kind of more conservative-leaning Democrats. They identify, in particular, a set of policy priorities where they consistently say that there are solutions that exist and a foundation from which we can build. Those issues in particular are around renewable energy, around clean water, and to some extent around infrastructure. These solutions voters also see technology as very much a part of the solution in terms of addressing some of the challenges that we have related to renewables and clean water and infrastructure. They are a group that is also both pro-renewable and supportive of fossil fuels. And I want to talk about that because their dual support for both of those approaches is very important to them. This slide gives you a sense of how the solutions voters fit into the overall electorate. So in 2017, they represent a little more than a third of the overall electorate, 38% here. As I mentioned earlier, we've been tracking them for civil society since 2014, and it varies between about a third and a little less than half of the electorate. So they are a very sizable group of voters, and distinct from those earlier blocks of voters who Vince just described to you. So on this slide, you get a sense of the demographic profile of solutions voters. They are actually slightly less likely to be college educated or college graduates. Their gender split mirrors the electorate overall of 52% women, 48% men. They are slightly younger than the electorate overall. A little more than half are under the age of 50. Interestingly, they're more likely to be voters of color. So a little bit more likely to be African American or Hispanic. They are slightly more likely to be voters where faith plays a role, attending religious services frequently. As I mentioned earlier, in terms of their party composition, there are both Democrats and Republicans in this cohort of solutions voters, and a good number of both. But to the extent that they are dominated ideologically, they are more likely to be conservative Democrats, and that voters in this cohort are less likely to be strong partisans, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. This gives you a sense of how solutions voters break out and see specific policy regarding renewable energy in particular. So these four statements, and I'd like to take the top and the bottom together. So the first is accelerating the development of renewable energy sources could create thousands of new jobs. Solutions voters are especially enthusiastic about the connection between increased use of renewables and job creation. You can see that's consistent from 2016 to 2017. And then the bottom statement that addresses how the development of renewables will result in cleaner air and cleaner water. Again, solutions voters are very enthusiastic about this connection. They have been over the last 2 years that we've been tracking them. So you see support here for action and benefits around renewable energy, whether those are job creation or cleaner water and clean air. But then the middle two statements are also important to understand in terms of the framework of solutions voters. The second statement concerns the role that fossil fuel plays in our economy as a cornerstone of our system. And the third statement that fossil fuels, that the transition away from fossil fuels could result, at least temporarily, in increase in expenses, making products more expensive. And so solutions voters are capable of that complex thinking and seeing multiple sides of an issue. They are definitively pro-renewable, but they also have concerns about the transition away from fossil fuels. And those shouldn't be ignored or overlooked as we think about mobilizing and identifying solutions voters. They have real potential to to be advocates and supportive of renewable energy, but we really do have to understand and identify with some of their concerns around this transition. This gives you a sense of how solutions voters break out on 6 different issues. The 3 to the left are related to water, and you can see the differential between the solutions voters, who are shown in orange, and the rest of the electorate, shown in gray, is not very significant on those first 3 issues related to water. So pollution of lakes and streams make them less safe for fishing, swimming, and other recreation. Water management, especially in regions where water is scarce, is broken and needs to be fixed. And the dangers of pesticides and chemicals from ranching and farming polluting our water. So on those 3 issues, particularly related to water, there's a lot of concern among both solutions voters, but frankly also among other groups in the electorate. What distinguishes solutions voters is the 3 policy positions that you see on the right side of this graph concerning infrastructure. Solutions voters are significantly, about 13 points, more likely to be supportive and enthusiastic around updating the country's water infrastructure system. On this next point related to the use of fossil fuels, ensuring that water stays safe for consumers. Again, there's an important differential between solutions voters, 50% of whom are supportive and enthusiastic, a 17-point differential compared to voters overall. And then on the last point here, the rise in ocean levels due to warming has been exaggerated. Solutions voters are somewhat more skeptical about some of that evidence, and some of that is their information, their higher level of engagement and higher level of information. As I will talk about, they are also capable of kind of this complexity of being able to see multiple sides of an issue, and frankly, they leave the conversation about some of the impacts of climate change with some confusion because of how they see the complexity of the issue. Just to give you a summary of solutions voters, they are in fact a significant portion of the electorate. In our 2017 survey, again, they were 38% of registered voters. That they are strongly, the second point here, they are strongly pro-renewable. But again, remembering the point that they also have concerns about how we're going to make this transition away from fossil fuels. They are enthusiastic about doing so, but they have concerns that I think are important for us to keep in mind and to address. And then the final point here about solutions voters is that they truly represent a very rich target audience for mobilizing and giving voice to the enthusiasm around renewables. That these are voters who are very capable of being allies and being advocates, so the potential for them, especially given their level of engagement and their overall news attentiveness, is really strong, and I think holds a lot of promise.
Thanks, Molly and Vince. As you've heard, CSI believes there are several strategic implications of this research worth considering. We look forward to working with industry, solar installers, those in building trades, and renewable energy advocates to see how we collectively can continue the adoption of renewable energy in this country. Thank you for joining us, and that concludes the presentation of the Civil Society Institute's research on public support for renewable energy.